A homeless woman saved a child, and when the father came to thank her, he realized that this was his first love. The streets of the city on this autumn day looked the same as always: gray asphalt, hurrying people, the hum of cars and the smell of coffee from the nearest cafes. But in this chaos, there was a moment that changed everything. None of the passers-by would have paid attention to the little boy who suddenly tore off the sidewalk and ran straight to the road. His name was Ben, and he was only 8 years old, but he had already learned one important skill: ignoring the shouts of adults. "Stop! Come back here!" yelled loudly to his babysitter, a young girl who had just let him out of her sight. Ben wasn't listening. He spotted a small puppy lost in the middle of a busy street and ran toward him, not thinking about the cars that whizzed by. Passers-by froze as they watched, but no one moved. Fear and the instinct of self-preservation restrained people, and the crowd preferred to watch rather than act. But one woman who was sitting on a street corner drew attention to herself. She was dressed in an old jacket, her shoes looking like they had walked too many miles. At first glance, she was as invisible to society as any other homeless person. But the moment Ben came within a hair's breadth of hitting a car, this woman snapped out of it. She rushed forward with amazing speed, grabbed the boy and pulled him to the sidewalk just seconds before impact. "What are you doing?" she said sternly but with concern as she lowered the boy to the ground. Her eyes sparkled with a mixture of anger and relief. Ben stared at her with wide-open eyes. I wanted to help the puppy," he mumbled, trying not to cry. The woman turned to the puppy, who thankfully managed to escape to safety, and then looked at Ben. "You almost got hit by a car yourself, hero," she said, grinning slightly, but her gaze was serious. By this time the babysitter had already run up to them, grabbed the boy's arm and began apologizing profusely. The woman just shook her head and walked off in the opposite direction before anyone could ask her a single question. A couple hours later, James, Ben's father, arrived at the school by car. He had been called from work, told about the accident. He heard how scary it had been, how this woman had saved his son literally from under the wheels of a car. "Where is she? Where is that woman?" he asked, looking around, but the babysitter only shook her head. "I didn't get a chance to thank her, she left right away." James felt a strange feeling build up inside him. He was a man who was used to being in control of everything, but this situation threw him off balance. He took his son by the shoulders, looked him in the eyes and asked, "Do you remember what she looked like?" "She was kind," Ben said. "And she had warm hands." James hesitated. He couldn't leave it at that. A woman had saved his son and he didn't even know her name. James sat in his car with his hands on the steering wheel, but without turning on the ignition. He looked at the rear mirror where his 8-year-old son's face was reflected. Ben had already calmed down, but was still in the state of a child trying to hide the remnants of the stress he'd been through. James saw this, but didn't know what to say. "You really weren't scared?" he finally asked, trying to sound calm. Ben shrugged. "I knew the puppy was scared too. I had to help him." James closed his eyes to pull himself together. He was well aware that Ben was acting on emotion, as any child would. But just thinking about what could have happened made his hands go cold. "Do you realize what could have happened? Cars don't have time to stop that fast. You could have gotten hurt." His voice was soft but firm. Ben remained silent, staring at his shoes. "Do you even remember what that woman looked like?" James asked, shifting his attention. "Yeah," Ben replied, finally lifting his head. She was, like a kindly grandmother, only not old. She had short hair and a jacket, so warm, but really old. That detail caught James' attention. Something in Ben's words struck him as important, but he couldn't yet figure out what. At home, James poured himself a glass of wine, but didn't touch it. Ben was already asleep, and he couldn't stop thinking about that woman. Lately, James had gotten used to life being on a schedule: work, his son, occasional visits with friends. Everything went according to plan, no strong emotions, no surprises. And now he couldn't find peace. He thought of his ex-wife, Sarah. They'd divorced 3 years ago, and he'd tried to cope with the new reality, but it hadn't been easy. Since then, he had hardly been distracted by anything outside of his duties. However, this story made him feel a strange mixture of gratitude and guilt. The woman had saved his son, and he didn't even know where to find her. The next day, James returned to the place where it all happened. He started asking passers-by, people working in the neighboring stores, hoping to find some clue. "Have you seen a woman here who helps people?" "She saved my son yesterday," he asked. Some shook their heads, not sure what he was talking about. But one elderly fruit seller who was standing at his counter finally gave him an answer. "Yes, I know her. She comes here a lot. Mary's name is Mary. Poor woman, lives wherever she can, but never takes too much. Always helps others." Mary, James repeated, as if the name was familiar to him, but he couldn't remember where from. "If you want to find her, try the park on the corner. She likes to feed the pigeons there," the salesman added. James thanked him and went to the park. He found her half an hour later, sitting on a bench. She was indeed feeding the pigeons, tossing them crumbs from a small paper bag. James stopped in the distance, feeling everything turn over inside. It wasn't just gratitude, there was something in her features that caught him. Something painfully familiar. Finally, he took a step forward. "Excuse me. Are you Mary?" The woman raised her head. Her eyes were clear, but there was a tiredness in them. She nodded, and a slight smile appeared on her face. "I'm James. The father of that boy you saved yesterday. I wanted to thank you." She nodded slightly, as if it didn't matter. "You're welcome," she said. "I did what any man should have done." James noticed that her voice trembled, but she did her best to hide it. "Do you realize that you saved my son?" His voice became firmer. "You risked your life, and I want to know how I can thank you." Mary shook her head. "I don't need anything. Just be careful with him. He's a good boy." The words were said with such warmth that James felt even more obligated. "Maybe I can at least help you out? With a place to live or a job?" Mary smiled, but her smile was sad. "I'm used to my way of life. Thank you, but I don't need any help." James wanted to say something, but suddenly he saw something familiar in her face. There was something in her features, in the way she spoke, that gave him a sense of déjà vu. He looked at her and everything inside screamed that he knew her. James couldn't take his eyes off Mary. Her voice, the way she moved her hands, even her gaze, everything seemed surprisingly familiar. But why? How could he possibly know this woman? He wanted to ask directly, but something inside stopped him. "Are you sure I can't help you?" he repeated, trying to make his voice sound neutral. Mary shook her head again. Her movements were calm, but there was some wariness read in her eyes. "You've already helped. You care about your son. That's enough. James frowned. Her words sounded like she knew more about him than she should have. But he suppressed the feeling, deciding he was just winding himself up. Ben said you have warm hands, he said abruptly to change the subject. Mary smiled slightly, and something resembling warmth flashed in her eyes. He's a good boy. Reminds me of someone from the past. James tensed at hearing that. He wanted to ask what she meant, but she had already gotten up from the bench, about to leave. You're leaving? He asked, feeling like he was missing the moment. Yes, she replied. I have to go. Where to? Mary stopped and turned around. Anywhere you want to go. But thank you for finding me. The phrase sounded like goodbye, though he couldn't understand why. James remained on the bench, staring after her. Her figure quickly disappeared behind the trees of the park, leaving behind many questions. Something was wrong. He felt it with every fiber of his being. He returned home, but thoughts of Mary kept him awake. Her face kept popping into his head over and over again. Who was she? Why was he sure he knew her? He started going through old photos, hoping to find a clue. There were school albums, prom pictures, trips to the sea with friends. And suddenly he saw her. In one of the photos, taken over 20 years ago, it was her, Mary. Only younger, with long hair and a wide smile. It was prom night. She was standing next to him, and he had his arm around her shoulders. Oh my God, James whispered, holding the picture in his hands. It was her, his first love. Mary and James had met when they were both 17. She was the kind of girl who could light up an entire auditorium with one look. They dated for almost 2 years, planning their future, dreaming of moving to another city. Everything seemed perfect until one day she just disappeared. He didn't understand what had happened. Her family was silent, her friends said she had left, but no one knew where. It was like someone had ripped out a piece of his life and left a void. Now, years later, she has reappeared. But how did she end up on the street? Why didn't she recognize him? Or did she recognize him, but she hid it? The next day, James returned to the park. He needed to know the truth. You're here again, came her voice. She was standing by the same bench, carrying the same bag of crumbs for the pigeons. I found an old picture, he said, looking directly at her. She didn't answer, but her face changed. The slight tension in her eyes gave away her reaction. That was us. Do you remember? Mary looked up at him, and something like regret flashed in her gaze. She wanted to say something, but instead only lowered her head. Why did you leave then? He asked, feeling everything boiling inside. It wouldn't change anything, she answered quietly. But you knew who I was. You knew, and you didn't say anything. She raised her head and met his gaze. I didn't want you to know what I had become. Her words pierced him like a knife. You saved my son, he said after a pause. But why did you choose to disappear from my life? Mary sighed, as if gaining strength. James, everyone has their own road. And my road didn't lead where I dreamed it would. Put it in the past. I can't leave it in the past, Mary, his voice grew louder. You were a part of my life, and now I've met you again. How can I just ignore it? She was silent for a long moment, then spoke up, the truth is too complicated, James. And you don't want to know it. James kept his gaze on Mary, waiting for her answer. Her face remained calm, but there was an inner struggle in her eyes. He could see her trying to keep her distance, as if she was afraid the truth would break something important, in him, in her, or in what bound them together. "Why are you so afraid?" he finally asked. Mary exhaled without raising her head. She sat down on the bench again, tossing a few crumbs to the pigeons that circled lazily around her feet. "I'm not afraid, James," she finally replied. "I just know you won't be able to understand." "Try," he said, sitting down next to her. She looked up at him, and there was so much weariness in her gaze that for a moment he felt guilty. "Do you want to know why I left then?" she asked, and her voice got a little louder. "Yes," James nodded. Mary fell silent, as if gathering her wits. "You were right," she said finally. "I knew who you were from the beginning. When you came up to me in the park, I recognized you right away. Your eyes, your voice. I would never forget them." James froze. Her confession hit him like a thunderclap. "Why didn't you say anything?" His voice shook. "Because I didn't want you to know what I'd become," she repeated, now looking directly into his eyes. "Mary, it doesn't matter. You saved my son. You've already done more than anyone else. What makes you think I'm judging you?" She grinned slightly, but there was more bitterness than joy in that smile. "James, you don't know what I've been through. What made me become who I am now. You saw me then when I was different, full of hopes, dreams, plans. You didn't see it all disappear. So tell me," he said. "Are you sure you want to hear it?" "Yes, I'm sure." Mary was silent again. She stared at the pigeons, who were now scattered on the sidewalk, as if her own thoughts were spreading out in different directions. "When you and I were dating, I thought we had a future. I really believed that. But then," her voice trailed off. "Then what?" James leaned forward slightly, as if he was afraid he'd miss her words. "Then my family started falling apart," she continued. "My mom got sick and I had to leave everything behind to take care of her. I knew that if I stayed with you, I wouldn't be able to cope. So I made a choice." "Why didn't you tell me that?" he asked, feeling a painful emptiness spill into his chest. "I couldn't," she replied. "You would have tried to stop me. And I couldn't let myself think about what I wanted. I had to be where I was needed most." "But you could have come back," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "Where to?" She looked at him with a bitter smile. "By the time it was over, I had no more strength, no more home, no more meaning. Everything I loved was already in the past." James didn't know what to say. He could feel her words slowly but surely pulling everything he thought was true out of him. "You could have come to me," he said, barely audible. "I couldn't," she answered. "I didn't want you to see me like this. Mary, you were always more to me than mere looks or success. I loved you." She looked at him with such longing that he realized that was all he wanted to say to her then, but never had the chance. "Loved," she repeated, as if tasting the word. "That was a long time ago, James. We've become different." "Maybe," he said. "But you're still a part of me." Mary lowered her gaze, and something akin to regret flashed in her eyes. "You can't change what's already happened," she said quietly. "But I can help you now," he said. She shook her head. "You don't have to do that, James." "Why not?" "Because it won't change my past. And your future is too important for you to waste it on a man who's already lost everything." James sat in his car, parked outside the park where his conversation with Mary had just ended. Her words rang in his head, crashing into his consciousness time after time, "You can't change my past." But something inside him didn't agree with that. He couldn't just let her go. The past came rushing back like a rushing wave. The school years, those happy days when life seemed carefree, when he could dream of anything, knowing that Mary was there for him. They were like two inseparable companions, she bright and bold, he her quiet support. James remembered the first time he met Mary. It was their freshman year of high school. She had moved to town with her family and had immediately caught the attention of half the class. She had a bright smile that could outshine the sun and a confidence that drew people in. But she didn't seek to be the center of attention. One day after class, she approached James, who was sitting under a tree with a book in his hands. "What are you reading?" she asked, taking a seat next to him. He looked up, slightly confused. "Just a textbook. Test tomorrow." She laughed. "Studying for the future?" "Something like that," he replied, still not understanding why she'd come up. "You know, the future's fun, but sometimes you should enjoy the present. Like going for a walk, for example. Want to keep me company?" And so it began. Soon they became inseparable. Their friendship blossomed into something more. They did homework together, went out on weekends, and talked about life for hours. James had always admired how easily she found answers to difficult questions, how she wasn't afraid to challenge something that seemed unfair to her. And then they fell in love. It was the kind of first love you remember for the rest of your life. They planned for the future, moving to another city, getting jobs, maybe even attending the same college. "We'll always be together," she said one day, lying next to him on the grass. "Promise?" he asked. "I promise." But everything changed a few weeks before their graduation. Mary suddenly became aloof. She no longer laughed like she used to, avoided talking about the future. James sensed something was wrong, but she didn't speak up. "Mary, what's going on?" he asked one day. "Nothing, James. Everything's fine," she replied, but her eyes said otherwise. And then she disappeared. It was like a thunderclap. Her house was empty, her family was gone, leaving town without warning. None of her friends knew where they'd gone. James searched for her, calling, writing letters, but there were no answers. Instead, what remained was a void. He could never fill that hole in his heart. And now, 2 decades later, she reappeared. But it was a different Mary. Life had changed her, made her strong, but tired, withdrawn. James couldn't bear to hear her say, "You can't change my past." Was that true? He didn't believe it had to be. He pulled out his phone and called his friend Mark, who worked in social services. "Mark, I need help," he said. "What happened?" "I met someone from the past. She's in trouble. Her name is Mary. She lives on the street." Mark was silent for a moment. "And what do you want to do?" "I want to help her. Find out what happened to her. Maybe she has some relatives left. I just can't leave her like this." "Okay," Mark replied. "I'll see what I can do." James breathed a sigh of relief. Now he knew he would do whatever it took to figure out her story. He didn't have to wait long. Mark called back a couple days later. "James, I have some information. But you'd better find out in person." "What did you find out?" just show up. It's not something that can be explained over the phone. James arrived at Mark's office the next day. The whole night was spent worrying and thinking about what he might find out. Mary was hiding something important, that much was obvious, and Mark appeared to have unearthed a clue to her disappearance. "Sit down," Mark gestured to a chair across from his desk. A thin file folder lay on the desk. The inscription on the cover read, "Mary Wilson." "I've been researching her story," Mark began. "And I must warn you that it's not what you're expecting." "Just tell me." James tried to remain calm, but inside he was burning up. Mark opened the folder and began to speak. After her family left the city, they faced serious financial difficulties. Her mother was sick, the medical expenses were enormous. Mary seemed to take it upon herself to help out in some way. James listened without blinking. She started working several jobs without being able to study. But it still wasn't enough. And then, apparently, she got in touch with people who offered her money to be a guarantor for a large loan. It ended up being a scam. She had a debt pinned on her that she couldn't pay off. James frowned. Why didn't she seek help? Because at the time she felt like no one would help her. She was trying to protect her family. She ended up losing her home, her job, and being alone. Mark raised his eyes to James. She's been wandering around for over a decade, scraping by on casual labor. Those words hit James like a truck. He couldn't believe that the girl he loved had gone through all that alone. Why didn't she say anything to me? We could have gotten through this together. James, Mark sighed heavily. People sometimes choose silence because they don't want to be seen as weak. She probably thought you'd have a better future without her. James wrapped his arms around his head. He tried to realize how much pain and sacrifice Mary hid behind her calm face. "Where is she now?" he asked, lifting his head. "I don't know. But I'm sure you'll find her." James went back to the park where he had last seen Mary, but she wasn't there. He started asking around to the locals, walking the streets where she might be. But no one had seen her. "Please tell me where she is," he asked over and over, but received only indifferent looks or shrugs of the shoulders. His heart shrank with each passing hour. He could not leave it like this. On the third day of his search, he found her. She was sitting in the backyard of an abandoned building, warming herself by a small makeshift stove. Her jacket was even more ragged than he remembered, but her eyes still sparkled with warmth when she spotted him. "You're here again," she said, showing no surprise. "Why didn't you tell me anything then?" His voice trembled. Mary looked at him carefully, but was in no hurry to answer. "What difference would it have made?" she uttered at last. "Everything," he answered sharply. "We could have managed together. You wouldn't be here." She smiled slightly. "James, you don't understand. You were my dream. And dreams are something you have to let go of to fight reality. You were my life, Mary," he said. Her eyes filled with tears, but she quickly looked away. "You can't help me, James. My past is already written. But your future isn't," he said firmly. Mary turned away from James, pretending to be busy tossing wood into the makeshift stove. He stood behind her, staring at her, feeling his insides tighten. Her words, her refusal to accept help, it all seemed unbearable to him. "What makes you think I can't help?" he finally asked. "Because you live in a different world, James," she replied without turning around. You have a house, a job, a son, a life. And I have nothing. How are you going to connect those two worlds? He stepped closer, unwilling to give up. Mary, it's not about different worlds. It's about me knowing who you are. And who you were to me. You think I'm going to forget everything that happened between us just because time has passed? That's impossible. She finally turned, and in her eyes he saw a mixture of pain and weariness. James, I know this is important to you. But it's not to me, she said, her voice firm but trembling. I've gotten used to this life. It's become my reality. He froze. Her words hurt, but he sensed there was something more behind them. You're lying, he said quietly, looking her straight in the eye. Mary tensed, her gaze stern for a moment, but then her shoulders slumped, as if she realized resistance was futile. Lying? She interjected. Why would I lie? I have nothing. What have I got to lose? Pride, he answered. You're afraid I'll see what you've been through and feel sorry for you. But I don't pity. I admire. Her eyes filled with tears. James, she began, but her voice trembled and she fell silent. Mary, I know you've had a complicated past. But that doesn't define who you are now. You saved my son without thinking of yourself. That's more than anyone else could have done. She was silent for a long moment, then sat back down on the crate next to the fire. You don't know everything, she said at last. So tell me, he suggested gently. She looked up at him, and her face grew serious, as if she were about to spill the hardest secret she had kept for years. When you and I were together, I thought we could make it work. I really believed that. But when Mom got sick, I knew I had to be with her. It seemed right at the time. But then it got worse. James didn't interrupt, giving her a chance to continue. Dad was a weak man. When Mom died, he left me alone with debts and all the chaos. I tried to cope, but I couldn't. I thought if I came back to you, you'd see me broken. And I couldn't let that happen. She covered her face with her hands, unable to hold back the tears. Mary, James knelt down in front of her. You don't understand, she said, taking her hands away from her face. I didn't walk away from you. I left myself. He took her hands in his. It doesn't matter. We can start over. She looked at him longingly. Do you really think it's that simple? Yes, he answered. Because I believe in us. She stared at him for a long moment, then exhaled as if giving up. James, I'm afraid you're wrong. Let me prove I'm right, he said firmly. Mary sat in front of James, her face was quiet, but her eyes reflected the struggle. She was silent for a long time, as if searching for the right words, but everything that needed to be said seemed too much for normal conversation. James, you know things have changed, don't you? She finally said, her voice sounding calm but sad. I know, he replied. But that doesn't mean all is lost. She shook her head, but there was no irritation or anger in her movement. Just weariness. You still see me as the girl you knew. But she's gone. I'm not that Mary anymore. And I don't know if I can be her again. James leaned closer to catch her gaze. Maybe you don't have to become that Mary. Maybe you are who you need to be right now. But that doesn't mean you have to be alone. Her eyes clouded over and she turned away, staring at the dying fire in the stove. You don't understand what it means to me, she said quietly. Accepting your help is like admitting that I couldn't make it on my own. And I've convinced myself for so long that I should be strong. James gently placed his hand on her palm. The power isn't in doing everything alone, Mary. Strength is letting the people who love you help. You helped me, saved my son, without thinking of yourself. Now it's my turn. She stared at his hand for a long moment, then exhaled slowly, as if giving up. I don't know how to start, she admitted. We'll start together, he said. Over the next few days, James sprang into action. He arranged with Mark to get Mary temporary housing and found a local charity willing to help her recover. Mary resisted at first, but gradually began to accept the changes. James brought Ben to visit her, and their conversations with the boy became some of the few moments when her face lit up with warmth. He reminds me of you, she said once, smiling as Ben told a story about helping at school to collect food for the orphanage. I think he's more like you, James replied. In the back of her mind, however, Mary still struggled with doubts. One evening as James drove her to the new place where a room had been prepared for her, she stopped at the door and looked at him. Do you really think I can change things? She asked. I know you can, he replied. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slightly and went inside. A few weeks passed. Mary started volunteering with the same organization that had helped her, and James continued to support her. They saw each other more often, but there was always a slight distance between them, as if the past still separated them. One evening as they sat together on a park bench, Mary spoke up. James, I want you to know. Even if I can't be the person I used to be, I'm grateful for everything you've done. You gave me a chance I didn't deserve. You deserve it more than anyone else, he said. She looked at him, her face serious but soft. Not everything that is lost forever, she said. He nodded, realizing that her words were as much for him as for herself. There was no end to their story, only a new spin. Mary continued to rebuild her life, taking herself step by step back to who she could be. And James stayed by her side, not imposing, but making it clear that he was always there to support her. The finale left more questions than answers. Will they be able to return to each other? Will Mary find peace within herself? But perhaps that was the strength of their story, an open door leading to something new.